The cursor blinks against a white screen, and a hand hovers over the keyboard. Behind that hand is someone who has wanted to write a story for months. The story is clear in their mind, but the first sentence refuses to come. They tell themselves they are not ready yet. What they do not yet realize is that readiness rarely arrives before the first word appears on the page. The feeling of not being ready feels like a fact about the task. It whispers that more preparation is needed, more courage, better timing. This logic seems impossible to argue against from inside the hesitation. After all, no one wants to start something important feeling clumsy and afraid. So the person closes the laptop and waits for the confidence they assume must come first. The waiting feels responsible, but the story grows further away with each passing day. And that is the first turn. Waiting for readiness can become the very thing that prevents it. Psychologists have described this as the readiness trap. It is the assumption that a feeling of inner preparedness must arrive before external action makes sense. This trap can attach itself to writing a story, starting a difficult conversation, or learning a new skill. At its core is a risky but misleading belief that motivation and action run in one direction. First you feel ready, then you begin. But a large body of behavioral research points to something more surprising. Action often generates the emotional state we think we need in advance. Instead, starting a small action can shift mood, confidence, and perception of difficulty. The hand that types one shaky sentence begins to feel less like an imposter and more like a person writing. This is not a trick or a slogan. It is a predictable psychological process. Behavioral activation research has shown that engaging in goal-directed actions, even when motivation is absent, gradually reduces the weight of negative emotion. The shift happens not because the fear disappeared beforehand, but because the action gives the brain different information. Before starting, the brain mainly simulates threat and social cost. Once a concrete action begins, the brain also receives evidence of coping, small progress, and survivable effort. That evidence makes the next action slightly easier to take. Return to the hovering hand. If readiness were a true requirement, the first sentence would be impossible for almost everyone. Writers, athletes, and musicians often report that the initial minutes of a session feel heavy and unconvincing. Confidence does not always precede competent performance. More frequently, competent performance slowly builds confidence. So the first explanation, waiting to feel ready, breaks at this point. Why then does the body signal such strong resistance before a new beginning? One account comes from the study of emotion regulation and procrastination. Procrastination is not simply a time management problem. It is often a way to regulate a difficult feeling. The emotions that arise near a blank page, such as anxiety, self-doubt, and fear of judgment, feel sharp and immediate. Avoiding the task works as a short-term mood repair strategy. When you close the laptop, the anxiety drops quickly, and that relief is powerfully reinforcing. The brain learns that not starting brings emotional relief, and it chooses that path again tomorrow. What feels like waiting for readiness is actually a learned preference for a quick escape from discomfort. Over time, this pattern can deepen because the task grows larger in the imagination. The story becomes not just a document, but a test of intelligence, creativity, and worth. Researchers have found that perfectionism and fear of failure often hide behind chronic hesitation. A perfectionist may believe that a single imperfect sentence reveals a permanent inability. Faced with that exaggerated expectation, waiting until the conditions feel safe can seem like the only reasonable option. But the conditions never feel safe enough because the standard shifts upward each time the task is postponed. This is not a character flaw. It is a self-protect strategy that carries a high and hidden cost. The person remains stuck between a desire to create and a fear that their creation will confirm their worst doubts. And yet, the brain also contains a mechanism that can break this cycle. Action does not need to be confident to be clarifying. Even a tiny, imperfect start gives the brain a clearer picture of the true difficulty. What felt monumental before beginning often shrinks within minutes of actual engagement. My mind conjures a catastrophe when I only imagine giving a speech, but my actual voice, once it begins, discovers a conversational tone. That gap between the imagined task and the performed task is where readiness is born. Readiness, in this sense, is a product of doing rather than a prerequisite. The person at the desk does not yet know that the first ugly sentence is an act of psychological architecture. It sends a small but unmistakable signal. I am not in immediate danger. I am surviving this. That signal makes a second sentence more likely, and a third. Gradually, the brain recalibrates its estimate of threat and ability. This recalibration is not a single decision, but a rolling negotiation between expectation and experience. Now return to the room. The laptop remains closed, and the story remains locked inside the feeling of not being ready. Days have passed, and a second layer of distress has appeared: guilt for not starting. Guilt adds weight, which makes the avoidance pattern even stickier. The person now carries both the original fear and the heavy sense of falling behind. This is where the hidden cost of the readiness trap becomes fully visible. Waiting for readiness does not simply delay achievement. It slowly erodes self-trust. Every day that passes with the laptop closed adds another piece of evidence that I cannot keep my own commitments. Self-trust is not a fixed personality quality. It is built and rebuilt through small acts of follow-through. When the gap between intention and action widens, the internal narrative shifts from "I am not ready" to "I am not capable." That shift changes far more than a writing project. It begins to shape how a person enters new relationships, considers a job change, or protects their own boundaries. The readiness trap, left unexamined, can become a readiness cage that extends into many corners of life. But the strongest revelation is not about the cost of waiting. It is about the surprising source of genuine readiness. Readiness is not a feeling that descends like good weather. It is a byproduct of the actions we take when the weather feels completely wrong. The hand that types while afraid is not bypassing readiness. It is constructing it in real time. Psychologists describe this as the confidence-competence loop. Competence grows through repeated attempts, and as competence grows, confidence begins to catch up. But that cycle can only begin if the first attempt occurs without confidence, without the feeling of being ready. Many people believe confident people feel ready before they act. The evidence suggests something closer to the opposite. People who appear confident have often accumulated many starts while feeling unready. They learned through experience that the feeling of readiness is an unreliable signal, and action is a more trustworthy guide. That insight reframes the entire struggle at the desk. The blinking cursor is not a demand for perfection. It is an invitation to begin the conversation between intention and action. What changes practically when we stop treating readiness as a green light and treat it as a later reward? One change is that we can negotiate the size of the start rather than the fact of the start. A single sentence, a single note, a single stretch on the running trail. These are units of beginning that the resistant brain can tolerate. Researchers call this the principle of incremental exposure. The mind can adjust to low doses of difficult activity more easily than to the whole imagined mountain. And once the dose is taken, the internal landscape shifts just enough to permit the next dose. The person at the desk does not need to finish the story today. They only need to write enough to discover that the screen does not bite. That small discovery is the true raw material of readiness. When they finally type the first imperfect sentence, the hovering hand stops being a symbol of trapped intention. It becomes an instrument that has made itself ready by moving. The readiness they wanted a month ago now arrives as a quiet byproduct, not as a prerequisite.